Hello, dear friends. Today is our 2nd August, Saturday, and today's material will start as the second series or continuation of my previous video. The European daughter or department of the American publication Politico reports today. The German police carried out a search in the house of the former deputy to the head of the Zelensky's administration. The search was carried out under the request of the NABU, the Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. The search was carried out in the Bavarian house of Rostyslav Shurma to the former deputy to the head of the Zelensky's administration. This was confirmed by the Ukrainian and German authorities. According to Der Spiegel, the search was carried out on July 15, under the request of the NABU. Shurma was appointed head of the President's Office of Ukraine in 2021 and was responsible for matters related to Ukraine's economy. He responded skillfully in a way that truly served his cause. So his brother benefited from government subsidies as the operator of solar power plants located in territories occupied by Russian forces. Shurma held that position until September of last year, when his dismissal was announced on the eve of a major reshuffle in Zelensky's cabinet. The main goal of which, or at least one of the key goals, it would seem, was to cover their tracks. And among these ends, the Shurma case was probably not alone. Soon after he left or was forced out, he moved to the Bavarian town of Starnberg for a well-earned retirement, instead of becoming the subject of an investigation and ending up behind bars. Reports about NABU's search requests targeting the Shurma family home sparked anger from the Ukrainian president, reports Politico, which the president of Ukraine came out against investigations on an international scale. This event became one of the main factors that affected the decision of Zelensky to sign a disputed law at the beginning of this month, which transferred anti-corruption agencies to the control of the executive authorities. When I literally quote everything, the source, so that I am not accused of making up some facts. I'll say right away. To the few remaining larvae of Ermak's office of the president, who have become very scarce lately. Politico has never been noticed in relations with the Kremlin and has never published paid-for, commissioned content. And now I will make my own comment. That is what, as the Politico writes, I comment on this passage of the policy. That the very fact that the NABU gave a request to the German police with a request to conduct a search in the house of Shurma caused the anger of the Ukrainian president, who was against the international cooperation in the investigation of the case. That is, in Ukraine, Shurma, did not want to investigate his case. They allowed him to leave for a deserved rest. And they can't investigate him once he's abroad. That is no more, no less than from the side of Zelensky, as in fact, the actions aimed at obstructing the investigation of the criminal case about the large-scale robbery of state funds by its closest environment. That is, it is already a criminal crime itself, and here I will tell you so frankly. A Western person, a payer, a voter, reading all this, he asks himself a question. If Zelensky makes such actions, putting himself under the risk, breaking the law, then probably there are extremely important reasons for this. And one of the first reasons that immediately comes to mind is probably that a person himself participates or participated in this case in some way. Otherwise, what is the point of covering the heavy criminal crimes of other people, his subordinates? Next, the policy reminds that the NABU has announced an accusation of corruption against 71 active and former deputy of the Ukrainian parliament, 71, and was not afraid to start an investigation into members of Zelensky's closest circle. That's just how things stand. The case of the investigation of corruption by the high echelon of the Ukrainian authorities. As we, gentlemen, hoped and discussed, and many dozens, if not hundreds of viewers wrote to me, when will this start? We will not be able to help without Western help. That is, we will not be able to handle it. Here it finally grumbled, and as it is sung in the famous Soviet song, the old, "This day we came close as we could and waited for it." And here it is, in fact, and came. And this is related to the last events, to the acceptance of this evil law, to the entire cancellation, after mass demonstrations in many cities of Ukraine. By the way, I captured a few, as my eye captured, a few messages or something on the forums from. I think these are people who are somehow connected with the administration or so, they just write stupidly. As for these mass demonstrations, that everything was organized and everything was probably paid off. And one of the viewers writes, "You are, Yury Borisovich, an experienced scouts, you should understand this." I will tell them, gentlemen, so as an experienced former scouts, I will tell them that I categorically do not believe that in Ukraine, like this, in several hours, in several cities, it is possible to organize mass protests with thousands of participants. And organize them out of selfish motives, some kind of. It was hinted that this is some kind of scary person or scary power paid it all off. And in the way that there are no marks left, but they hinted that this is probably done by Poroshenko. Scary person, chocolate king, it is impossible to do this, absolutely, absolutely impossible. And if someone began to do this, then at the very beginning this would become known and there would be facts. Because, well, I understand that the Ukrainian special services, that is loyal to President's office in Ermak, they conduct round-the-clock surveillance of both Poroshenko and his nearest circle. And among the 10,000 participants of the demonstration, there would almost certainly be agents who would report, as a fact, that they were offered 10 hryvnias, 100 hryvnias. Or how much there for a part, it would be documented, there would be a scandal. No, it was a genuine outburst from the people, mostly young folks. I saw today in the same Politico, a young girl of about 15-16 years standing with a carton and it says, "Yes," and then a non-censorial word. Well, like why? I have such authorities if it does not do anything useful for me. Here is our future. This is the bright future of Ukraine. Thank God it exists. Now the events are developing further, as we predicted in the previous video. Now, after the scam with the closure, or rather the subordination of anti-corruption departments, practically their pressure, the elimination did not take place. Now there must be a response move, and a strong one. We have assumed that now, with the reinforced support of the West, first of all in Europe, anti-corruption departments of Ukraine should intensify their fight. And specifically, there should be progress on those 71 active cases involving Ukraine's parliamentary members. As well as the members of the Zelensky's closest circle. Today I am opening, in addition to everything else, I have a favorite, or rather, not what is my favorite, but sites from which I start getting acquainted with the last news. One of these sites is a Russian site. Well, you have to know what is happening in the 6th room and what its patients care about. And as one of the main news, Budanov gave an interview. He gave an interview yesterday, and he gave an interview to NATO Masachuk. I think there's no need to explain further for my Ukrainian listeners and viewers, but for the international guests of the channel, let me clarify. She's a court TV host like Chairman Feng, always loyal to whoever's in power. That's one positive quality she definitely has. She manages to find common ground with every new administration that comes to power on a wave of harsh criticism of the previous one. Ideologically, she fits right in with every one of them. Well, I must say that the fact that suddenly, in the background of such a scandal with the NABU laws, Nataka Moisachuk immediately appears with the interview of Budanov. I personally understand that the case did not go without the help of President's office. And further, the further development of this event around this interview is a sign that yes, apparently, it had a meaning. It had a meaning of this interview, because the Russians paid attention to the main thing. The main thing is that they announced in his interview, Budanov's interview is that NATO is under the threat of its existence. And the policies being pursued by the current US administration could potentially lead to the breakup of NATO, but since NATO is, I don't know further. The next step, the next thought, whether Budanov has thought it through or not, I'll lay it out anyway. If NATO falls apart and the authorities, judging by the American one, judging by the Budanov's interview, they're pursuing harmful policies, then Ukraine ends up alone against Russia, which helps China, North Korea, Iran. So in a hopeless situation, that is it, with no choice but to lay down arms, surrender, or commit collective suicide. Here is such an interview, and this is one. Here is literally an announcement, one of the first in the line of those events that Russians consider the most important. I watched the interview. It gathered it among Ukrainian viewers on the Ukrainian website, where it was posted in 8 hours, 99, a little more than 99,000 people. That is little. Little because given the level of organization and coverage, apparently the organizers wanted more. It didn't work out anymore, but Russians twisted what they considered necessary, useful for them, and began to twist further. The goal of Russians was to bring this deep thought of Budanov to the administration of the United States, about the fact that Budanov, as an official representative of Ukraine, is not pleased with the current policy of President Trump and believes that it leads to a possible collapse of NATO. Well, true, Budanov said that he does not count this as a 100%, thank God, a guarantee of such a result of the development of the event. But he believes that this is possible. This is one of the likely ones. I remind you that according to the classification in the English language, it is likely more than 50%. That is, if it is already written in the analytic report, it is likely, it is serious already. It is not 50-50. It is more than 50% of the chance that it will be so. That is, Budanov so easily blurred the administration of Trump, said that there are more than 50 chances that NATO will fall apart. Well, people who have a logical mind should have understood that is an end for Ukraine. That is, in fact, Budanov admits more than 50% chances of Ukraine's defeat. And I read, well, to say that I came to a shocker state, this is nothing to say at first, means I did not have enough censor words to express all my emotions. Moreover, the day before, I heard on the radio an appearance or interview of a former military attaché of the UK in Moscow, in Kiev. who commented on Trump's statement about the fact that he is sending 2 nuclear submarines somewhere in response to the idiotic statements of Medvedev, and he said that Trump is thin-skinned. He does not like criticism, he reacts very sharply to it. He's not self-critical, so this is how it turned out. That is Budanov in the interview, which was, I'm sure, organized with the help of the head of the Zelensky administration, with the help of the leading courtier, Madame Masachuk. Reports that the leadership of Ukraine does not like it, or in any case, it, as one of the main scouts of the country, does not like the policy of President Trump, and it leads to the collapse of NATO. Well, what can be expected in these conditions? What the Russians, more precisely, what they're counting on by amplifying Budanov's interview. The fact that Budanov, one of the official people of Ukraine, the analyst who supplies the information to the main head of the country, he makes a blow to the President of the United States when a very positive, and in some cases an unprecedented shift in the United States' stance toward NATO. And, in general, the development of the NATO bloc in the direction of the strengthening of this very bloc and the strengthening of the support for Ukraine. I will now list it. Maybe for Budan it will all be a big mystery, but I will just list it. In one of the previous videos, I told you about the Chinese assessments. That Chinese believe that the recent trade agreement between the United States and the European Union, in fact, is creating the most powerful, unprecedented economic and military political bloc. The United States, Europe, not only NATO. NATO is a bone in military politics. Europe plus Ukraine. Well, good for Ukraine, because Ukraine is one of the main reasons for this creation. For what the leaders of the European countries fought, visiting the White House, there were Ukraine featured prominently in all those negotiations. Somehow Budanov missed. This is the unprecedented development of events that worried Beijing. Not for the sake of it, it worried. Then Trump announced a package of aid to Ukraine in the budget of $10 billion, but also not bad in any case. It is not a proof that he has now decided to destroy NATO. Then this is what is unprecedented. I will tell you more about this. During the Biden administration, Biden and his close assistants all tried helping Ukraine to keep NATO aside. That is, NATO has nothing to do with it. NATO does not help. Otherwise, if there is a bloc, Russia, against the entire NATO bloc, it can lead to a war with the bloc, and there is a fifth article and the United States. That is, it was one of the biggest mistakes of the administration. Not much was done by the Biden administration by mistake, but it was one of the serious and major mistakes. They kept NATO aside. Trump broke this model. He assigned NATO actually to be responsible for providing help to Ukraine. Now NATO collects what is needed, discusses this with the Ukrainian side, which makes lists, conducts analysis, including operational analysis of what to do in the battlefields, then makes a statement and transfer the money to this fund, which is created in Washington specifically for these purposes. That is, NATO is becoming directly involved in the war between Ukraine and Russia and its supporters in the face of North Korea, Iran, China. Well, is that all right? Overall, that's a good thing. Now NATO's role has increased to such a degree that it was never at all. In particular, it was not like this during the Biden administration. Then it increases. They have taken the responsibility of the European countries to increase their budgets. They are increasing them. They allocate the money that they did not allocate during the Cold War to the development of their defense industry. They are really working on this matter, starting production. They are looking for, if for now they will launch it, they are looking for this time, where can you find, as much as possible, those weapons systems that are critically needed in Ukraine now. Well, what kind of NATO collapse is here? What to do? I have the impression that Budanov somehow lags behind in life because, well, somewhere in March, it could be said then yes, the policy of the Trump administration is aimed at the collapse of NATO. This is really so, and we reflected all this here on this channel, but since then, a water break has occurred, literally, and we have discussed these reasons, first of all, for psychological reasons. This is all due to Putin, that bug, Kremlin's nuclear Medvedev helped him out, idiots. Thank them for this, our useful idiots in Moscow, in Kremlin, too. That is, the situation has changed, and nevertheless, Budanov does this for prediction more than 50% chance of NATO falling apart. And this means an inevitable more than 50% chance of inevitable Ukraine's defeat. And I'm curious, I can explain this by the fact that if he is in his mind still Budanov, everything is normal with him, then he was probably tortured in president's office, was given the orders, otherwise something terrible was threatened by, compromised probably, and what can they still do? Or he is seriously sick and requires replacement, or he just got away from life not knowing what he was doing. He is ideal, you see, there are things in which he would be ideal. GUR, like the SBU, performs wonderful diversified operations on the territory of Russia. They should have built a powerful unit for him, heck, even a whole division of saboteurs, and let them work effectively for the good of Ukraine by carrying out sabotage missions in Russia. But to release it with such an interview is a suicide for Ukraine. I remember telling a story from history once. When Nikita Khrushchev, he loved to drink kegs on official meetings, but sometimes he brought something that then people all over the world held their heads. And at a Politburo meeting, a special resolution was passed that forbade the first secretary of the CPSU Central Committee from drinking more than 2 shots of vodka. I don't know, maybe it makes sense in the parliament, although I do not see the forces that could take the obligatory decision or order for Budanov, prohibiting him from giving any public interview. Of which he's given more in the past 3 years than all the intelligence chiefs of the world combined. That is, this interview, this statement, on a large scale, if you separate the wheat from the chaff, this is actually the best way to kill the positive momentum that's just begun to emerge toward Zelensky's administration. Sorry, Trump to NATO and more broadly the attitude of NATO and the United States toward Ukraine and the support being provided to it. The last thing that is needed now is for the representatives of the Zelensky administration to give an interview with the accusation of Trump's administration. They have already announced it. They have accused from Moscow, from Kremlin, I mean Medvedev. He received 2 submarines. We will discuss all this later. But why is this needed? These suicide interviews of the representatives, the higher representatives of the Ukrainian authorities, this is not how it works. That is, what are you doing, guys? Stop these suicide interviews for Ukraine. I don't know, maybe Budanov is used here as a useful idiot, or... But you see, the coincidence of all these events, it is clearly this interview lies in the line of these corruption events that are now developing around the higher leadership of the country. And here are these laws and these demonstrations and here, get it. And you pay attention to how Russians caught it. That is, he said a lot of different nonsense there, but they seized on the key part, the bit most useful to them, and immediately started amplifying it. What he said is nonsense, evidenced by at least the article that was published yesterday in the publication, The Economist. The article was written by two people, Kurt Walker, probably everyone in Ukraine knows this name, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, former special representative of Ukraine, big friend of Ukraine, who did many useful things for our country, and the second is Nicola Gallange, former head of the Ministry of Defense of Germany. And the article is headed How European NATO Members Can Help Ukraine and Itself. That is, it is not about the destruction of NATO, quite the opposite, quite the opposite. I will summarize this article briefly. Trump's actions have given NATO a clearly special role in the acquisition and supply of military aid to Ukraine. This is a radical change that has deep consequences for the alliance, for Ukraine, and for Russia. For Russia, it is negative. Here it is reminded that one of the main directions of the political course of the Biden administration was to hold the United States and NATO aside from the war between Russia and Ukraine. There was fighting, there was fear of escalation, but now Trump has broken this taboo, and this opens up all sorts of opportunities. And one of them, they now offer a specific thing that can be done in the direction of the development of this new situation. The authors suggest that NATO should help Ukraine in its creation of air defense. Let me remind you that now the air defense system consists of a number of disbanded weapons systems purchased from various countries. The idea is to integrate them together on the basis of artificial intelligence, the last achievements of artificial intelligence. And create such a system when, first of all, you need to develop a target-oriented, not so far-fetched today one, tomorrow another, not knowing about what was done the day before yesterday, and so on. No, according to a single plan, develop a system of sensors in the right places, the right quality and tactical technical data. Then unify them into one system of collecting this information, which is then transferred to the center controlled by the artificial intelligence, which takes, or rather analyzes, takes the decision what it is, or rather determines in what danger the air is now facing Ukraine. And then makes an indication, gives an indication, on, again, the integrated system of air-to-air anti-aircraft defense, which should be multi-level. That is, against so that patriots do not shoot at drones, but so that drones meet the corresponding system of arms and such as the Patriots shot at others such as Kyrylo. And now, given the massive leap forward in artificial intelligence, all of this is basically doable. And the authors of the article say that this is what needs to be decided urgently at the moment for Ukraine. And this is not just some kind of king's gift for Ukraine. That is, NATO has a plan. NATO creates a system where it is reborn, creates a system for the future. Holding back Russia, this is all needed for NATO itself, so let's start with Ukraine. Moreover, it is possible to test all this there now, immediately on the battlefield, a unique opportunity. NATO has all for that. They have technology, they have experience, they have artificial intelligence for this. And a more effective opportunity for the creation of this system in Ukraine along the eastern flank of NATO, including, is difficult to find. Anyway, NATO, they say, will have to create this system for itself sooner or later, and start with the eastern flank. That is, what we'll build in Ukraine, they write, will essentially be the front line of our air and missile defense. And Ukraine will be de facto an associated member, de facto NATO, the code of creation of this unified system. Let me remind you that there is such a system of NURAT in the United States of America, not only in the United States but also in Canada. That is, protection. Trump probably does not know this, shouts that yes, you are a useless country, you will take money from us. And in fact, Canada is the front line of protection of the US territory from any possible missile attack. Earlier, it was the Soviet Union, now Russia. That is, the first stations are first Alaska, then Canada, and then the United States of America. Frontline, this is how the authors of this article think. Let's create all this now on Ukraine territory. They emphasize that it is not only about the protection of Ukraine, the goal is to ensure that NATO never faces such a vulnerability. That is, this system will allow NATO to achieve this goal. They further end their article as follows: we must be ready for a long and exhausting conflict. But every new step in our help provides great security and stability not only for the people of Ukraine, but also for Europe. It is important that the steps taken by us show Putin, this is attention, this is extremely important, this is now the most important task. Putin, why is he not going to negotiations despite all the threats made by Trump? Because he believes that he can achieve something further. So it says here, all these steps will show Putin that he has already reached the limit of his capabilities in Ukraine. And what's next? His position will not improve but deteriorate, and therefore it is necessary to put an end to the war. This system, the creation on the Ukraine territory, should lead to the movement of the mentality of Putin and his closest circle, and after all, to the negotiation table. Here is such a position of people who are involved in NATO, who are experts, have a massive connection, influence. This is what is being planned now. Therefore, Budanov and his department, instead of giving these idiotic interviews, need to connect somehow to this. To start with, to contact Mr. Walker, discuss this article and ask what we can do to implement this idea, because the idea is brilliant, truly grand. And in contrast to the statements in the interview of Budanov, it helps to strengthen the security of Ukraine and not the other way around. Well, the third topic that I wanted to expose to you today, the most important topic, I believe. That is, Trump is talking about 2 submarines, nuclear ones, which Trump has ordered to direct to specific locations. But in fact, I formulate for you, everyone treats it different. Who starts there from a military point of view, what can happen, where did they go, what kind of danger it can be for us, for them. Others say I brought in a completely right guess of the former military attaché of the UK in Moscow and in Kiev, that this is psychology. Trump took offense that some little punk like Medvedev, who doesn't even come up to his belly button, even when wearing high heels, suddenly started threatening him with some dead hand and all that. By the way, a dead hand is a complete bluff. If someone doesn't know, this is such a duck that was created even in the depths of external intelligence of the KGB in the 80s. When Reagan announced the Star Wars program in Moscow, it was accepted for a real thing, for a terrible threat, which the Soviet Union could not then resist in the technical and material plan. and began to come up with all sorts of scars that are now being developed in Putin, and especially in the last 3.5 years, everything new and new scars are being more and more developed in the Kremlin. So the scary thing was that there was a certain system, allegedly in the Soviet Union, and now they say they talked about this again with the return of Putin to the post of president. Or with the return in 2011, yes, in 2011. This is already after the Munich performance of Putin, when he began to play with muscles there. So this idea was reborn, and the idea is the following, that there is allegedly an automatic system in Russia, in the Soviet system, then in Russia, which, in case the enemy makes a crushing strike to the country, beats out 99% of all nuclear warheads of the country. In the first strike, and there is not much left, all the political and military leadership is destroyed. Everything, it would seem, and then the strike of mortal retribution, the dead hand type, presses on the button, and the rest of the missiles, mostly from submarines probably, which have more chance to theoretically survive. In such a situation, fly and strike the aggressor. So Medvedev began to claim that such a system now exists, so don't scare us here, and we still have hint about Poseidon and all that kind of stuff. And all this somehow came to light. There was a tsunami recently, right? Which hit Japan, then Kamchatka, Sakhalin, Peter Pavlov's Kamchatka, then the region. You know about this, right? And then someone appears in the space of internet, Oleg Tsiev. Well, my Ukrainian viewers know this character. This was a member of the team 2 times unjudged. A joke, the Ukrainians said so because he was twice judged, if not 3 times. Plus, he was also an agent of the FSB and, in combination, the president of Ukraine, Yanukovych. Well, then the Tsar, together with all this blood, ran away. He, in principle, was different from this whole gang from the fact that he had a very serious education. He got it in Moscow, in the Russian Soviet Union. I think he graduated from the Physics and Technology Institute. That is, there. Meaning, they didn't even accept anyone there through connections. They admitted only brilliant people with talent in physics and mathematics, and even at the times of Soviet Union there were half-legends going on. Even though I was told that this was the holy truth, that this institute had its own psychiatric clinic, because some students were in need of psychiatric help. There was so much pressure for these people, who created, first and foremost, the nuclear shield of the Soviet Union. So he ended it all, but then fate broke him, and I personally saw him at least a couple of times. He was clearly in a drug use when he gave an interview on Ukrainian television. Well, they say that a person suffers from this case, but this time without any signs of a bad influence. He told that as a result of this tsunami, which appeared as a result of the use of American climatic weapons, like the Americans made a nuclear explosion. That caused the tsunami. There was no earthquake, and the base of Russian submarines on Kamchatka was damaged. This is the story, and now Moscow is thinking what to do in response. That is itself, if you really imagine that this is real. This is an act of war, moreover, a strike of massive scales on a nuclear triad. That is, it is necessary to answer somehow. Let me tell you, I learned this question, or rather, I learned it since the 80s, back when I was working in the residency here in Washington. This is all nonsense. There are still no signs that someone has climatical weapons. I think this issue is settled because if it really existed since the 80s, which is when it first emerged. If I'm not mistaken, this is the story. That is, if it really existed, the corresponding leak would already have occurred. Serious people believe that such a weapon does not exist neither in Russia nor in the United States and in China. Well, whatever, in other words, it was just meant to scare. That is, there is no nuclear weapon, or rather, there is no climatical one. The Americans did not use it. They are not to blame for the tsunami that occurred, but a tsunami, here I would believe Tserv. He seems to be moving in exactly those circles in Moscow, apparently. It is quite possible, and even I would say probably, that the base of Russian submarines was damaged on Kamchatka. Well, taking into account how Russians build everything, including military objects, and maybe something bad happened to several submarines that were there. Well, and then this nuclear bug Medvedev is threatening with this hand, in general, with nuclear weapons, Poseidons, everything. Well, yes, the former military attaché said the right thing. Trump is a person of thin skin. He cannot bear such attacks against him, especially from someone who he called a failed president, a former one. Medvedev, and then Trump couldn't hold back anymore. He said that 2 submarines, he gave the orders, they went to the corresponding area. When he was then asked the next day what was the goal, he said, well, the former president of Russia threatened. And we must be serious about such a threat because the security of the country, the life of our people, that is, we must protect our people. And I made a decision. And it's still unclear whether those submarines actually deployed or not, but the key factor is that he can do it, moreover, especially if there's a real reason to do so. This message, I'm sure, is now spread in the Kremlin. Earlier, how much they did not talk, there was Putin, the same, who, you remember, when he announced on February 24th about the so-called beginning of the so-called special military operation. And then at the end, he threatened the West that if you dare to interfere in this case, then we have already made a decision. You will be hit so hard that you will experience the consequences that you have never experienced in the history of your existence. That is, in general, a cataclysm, the end of the world, we will destroy you. If only then, yes, and since then the Biden administration has been doing the same, that it has ignored. In Moscow, they saw this as a sign of weakness, which only escalated the tension, and that nuclear bluff became Putin's main weapon. As soon as the U.S. administration, together with NATO, declared a plan to do some actions, well, in particular, the supply of long-range missiles, the last one is Taurus. As soon as the West declared such plans, immediately from Moscow, either Soloviev, either Putin or Medvedev, it starts again, here we have Poseidon. You are coming close to the war, this is the last time Medvedev has stated this. Trump broke this, I would say so. He tore the venomous sting of that nuclear bluff right out of the jaws of those Kremlin nuclear pests, the Kremlin Putin, Medvedev, and others. They were worried. I think they will not shake this bluff anymore because they understood that there is a person here who can, well, theoretically. And no one wants to test it, whether he actually can or can't, but they understood that probably. And this one move, in fact, Trump, for which he is separately grateful, tore it out of their jaws. This is a bluff of nuclear weapons, which was their main weapon until now. And now, I believe it was necessary for a long time. It was necessary to go all out and take full action. I think that we will see this case in the near future. There will be long-range missiles, all the restrictions on their use will be removed. And the situation on the battlefield isn't as irreversible as the Kremlin likes to think. Everything will change, dear friends. It will change into a positive for Ukraine's side. And this includes the development and strengthening NATO. NATO, people are right to say, NATO starts with the fact of covering Ukraine, and this means the eastern flank of NATO. Then, as a basis, it's like a laboratory, in fact, the test in the combat conditions of these systems, which are always cheaper and more effective than testing it on computers. Then the same thing is covered by itself, its own sky. At that time, all those defense industry enterprises across NATO countries will be up and running. Then, the conversation was about NATO being ready to allocate 100 billion on rearmament, and a significant part of this money will go to the help of Ukraine. There are already 10 billion from the United States, 50 billion has already been allocated by Europe to the help Ukraine in general. This is only, I guess, for 1 year. And then the whole system is now being built in such a way that it can provide corresponding aid to Ukraine for a long period. And when this will be all created, and at the same time Russia will be struck by economic sanctions, and they will take full action, and there, it is already cracking everything. This is when we will return to the decision to the radical question of returning such territories, let's say, as Crimea. In the meantime, we will stop the enemy where he is and take care of the rearmament, with the restoration of the economy and the country's military capabilities, and training for restoration of justice from the point of view of international law. What I mean by full return of temporarily occupied territories. This is the end of today's video. Glory to Ukraine by the armed forces. The enemy will be broken, victory will be ours. You, dear friends, hold out the courage and firm believe in our inevitable victory. See you soon.